Hey everyone, we're going to get started. First, welcome to the first webinar of the News Media Alliance's News Impact Project. My name is Jennifer Peters and I am the reporter for Insights and Trends here at the News Media Alliance. A couple of quick housekeeping items before we get started. Please, if you are one of the presenters, if you've dialed in, please mute your line. If you have questions or comments, please use the chat function on the screen. There's also a Q&A box and a hand raise feature. They're all available to you. You can also tweet at us at News Alliance if you have questions. So there's a lot of options. And we'll also have a recording of the webinar, and slides will be available by tomorrow following the event. So you'll be able to see everything here. If you missed something, want to catch up, it'll all be here. So today, we're really excited to have members of the Detroit Free Press Newsroom here to discuss how they track impact of their journalism and how they use that information when working on other stories. Before we move on to tracking impact though, I want to introduce everyone to the News Impact Project. So news is how we navigate our lives, whether it's a new movie theater opening down the street, excessive spending of city officials, or a road maintenance project that will affect our daily commute. The information we get from our local news is what allows us to engage in our communities and with our neighbors. News publishers, however, are in a fragile state. Through the News Impact Project, we can demonstrate the importance of local news and drive support for local publishers by building an index of impactful stories that members of local communities would not have learned had it not been for their local news organizations. As part of the News Impact Project, the Alliance will be sharing a range of stories from participating publishers, all of which have one big thing in common. They had an impact on the community, and they would not have been shared if not for the local news publisher. While our project hasn't officially launched, it will launch next week, so be sure to keep an eye out for the announcement and more information in your email. But today you're going to get a little preview of what the web portal will look like. Here you'll be able to find information on submitting your own stories to the project, an impact index featuring all of the stories we've collected, and features on impactful journalism, from discussions of how to track and use impact to in-depth looks at local stories that had an impact on their communities, including stories from our friends at the Detroit Free Press who are graciously here today. Right now, we have 32 stories from 17 publishers, and our index of impactful news has been growing every day. If you're interested in submitting your own work to the project, we'll have information at the end of the webinar and how you can do that. Now, for the reason you're all here, how to track impact. The Detroit Free Press and their parent company, Gannett, are leading the way in tracking impact, with the Free Press having a dedicated page that allows readers to learn about the impact the Free Press journalism has had. That tracker exists in large part because of Anjanette Delgado, the Senior News Director for Digital at the Detroit Free Press. Anjanette is an expert on impact. She led development of an impact tracker at Gannett in 2016 and is a contributor to the USC Annenberg Norman Lear Center's Media Impact Project. In 2014, Chartbeat selected her as a leader in the field of real-time analytics for her work at lowhud.com, another Gannett property. Joining Anjanette today to discuss how they use this information that she tracks in the newsroom are some of her Detroit Free Press colleagues. We have Mark J. Rochester, the Senior News Director for Investigations, and we have reporters Phoebe Wall Howard, Joe Guillen, and Kat Stafford. We're thrilled to have everyone here, and we are so excited to hear from them about impact and what it means to track impact in your newsroom. So I am going to hand things over to Anjanette to get the conversation started.
Great, thank you, Jen. Thanks for the nice intro. As Jen mentioned, I'm Anjanette Delgado. I'm the Senior News Director for Digital at the Free Press. And I'm going to share my screen here so you can all look at slides. Let's see. Here we go. How's that? Great. So impact tracking is nothing new. You see a paper like mine, the Detroit Free Press. We started in 1831. One of our very first editorial campaigns was for Michigan to become a state, which it did a few years later. And even if you back up, a good 100 years before that into the 1700s, what you'll see is the partisan press, largely editor-owned newspapers, and founded with a definite mission and a cause, and very much you'll see newsroom crusades or editorial crusades. And so going all the way to the beginning of newspapers and news in America, you will see people interested in impact. And so then fast forward to even the late 1900s, and what you end up with there is you end up with a lot of newsrooms at this point. We all remember this time, right, where newsrooms at this point are largely corporate-owned, publicly traded companies with a healthy profit margin. And then we jump ahead to today, and it's quite a different story. Jen alluded to this in her intro, but it's quite a different story where you see sort of a changing of the business model, evolving of the business model. Some would say a falling apart of the business model. But as we turn away out of necessity or choice from depending on advertising, what you end up with is more of a need to do as some of our sisters and brothers in nonprofit newsrooms have been doing for many, many years, which is proving to the folks who are supporting the newsroom that there's a reason to continue that support. And oftentimes that is an impact report that's maybe an annual report to funders, to donors, and things like that. So you take that cue from nonprofit newsrooms, and I think there's space within for-profit newsrooms, and that's where I became involved. It was about 5 years ago, I guess, when I started really paying attention to this and seeing a place for it in for-profit newsrooms, where I don't think there was a lot of work being done at that point in for-profit newsrooms. And now you see a lot more folks interested in that, even in a for-profit newsroom that also seeks funding, right? So you might have a mixing of advertising as a model plus donor and funder support and things like that, or even newsrooms that are trying to make a case to subscribers. The message should not be, I believe, that our newsroom matters, but the work that's being done matters, and the community that we are serving matters. And so impact tracking sort of gets at that. So as I mentioned, I got into it about 5 years ago. I was at the Journal News in Rochester, New York, and that's where I started working in this. The Free Press has been a strong advocate of investigative journalism for some time, with a lot of impact to show for it for some time before I got here a year and a half ago, but we've really ramped up our impact tracking since then. So jumping ahead, let's see. So what do we mean by impact? And I think this is important. And for me and for most people paying attention to it, impact is real world change. And so you start with the journalism, or maybe even you back up before that into some of the activism that might be happening, or at least the people working in that space before you as a journalist enter that space. And then you start to do some reporting and some publishing, and then you see some change happening. And if you're very, very fortunate, what you see is change happens and somebody says, that's because of the Free Press. That's incredibly rare in my experience. I've seen it happen, but usually what you end up with is the reporter on the case is able to connect the dots, essentially. And in some cases, you will have the source agreeing, yep, I did that because of the work that you did. So it's difficult to track, but I'll sort of get into a little bit of how I can make it easier. So impact being real world change. There are three kinds of change: institutional, individual, and societal. And to read more about this, I really encourage you all to check out the work of Lindsay Green Barber. In my world, she's the godmother of impact tracking. She does some really amazing work and some amazing study into the different types of impact. But when you look at things like individual change, what you end up with is maybe a simple step that I can take as an individual to make a change. And I was working with a newsroom in Florida a year ago to identify some of their impact. And in that case, they had a fish kill that was easily cleared up by one person, essentially. So somebody could go out and in the course of a day or two, make a change that mattered quite a bit to that story and to that neighborhood. Then you move up to something like an institutional change, and that's where you talk about maybe laws getting passed, anything that forms as or operates as sort of a structure or an organization. So a law getting changed, some sort of hiring or firing or restructuring or anything along that level. And generally, you're going to see something like that takes a little bit more time, so there might be a larger gap between the last story you published and the change. It might take repeat publishing to sort of keep the pressure on. But that's a bit of a higher level change. And then a societal change is even a higher step than that, I think, because that's when you start seeing hearts and minds change, maybe group behaviors change. So you start seeing really sort of the system take hold at that point. So that's what we're looking at with change on individual, institutional, and societal levels. So I mentioned I started doing this at the Journal News, also called LOHUD, in New York, and I started very simply with a Google form. And I think it's really easy to do it if you don't let yourself sort of be held up by what you need to build to get this going. And so we got together as a newsroom, we agreed on what sort of impact we were going to pay attention to, and we made a list. And we started with a Google form and just asked people, when you see this in your story or as a result of your story, could you please fill this out? And what we were looking for in that case was a sort of a counterbalance to what we were seeing from a company level, which was a focus on page view goals. And I believe, just in context of talking about impact tracking, I believe that page views are very important. Readership is very important. A lot of the change that we're hoping comes out after our journalism doesn't happen if it doesn't reach a wide audience and people really get a chance to see the story and to understand it and to maybe respond to it. You know, that's where you see the ground swelling and that sort of thing. If somebody needs to make an individual change and they don't want to, but then all of a sudden there's this pressure because the audience is so large for that story, you'll start to see those changes happen. So page views, reach is another metric, very, very important to impact tracking, but it's not what we mean by very specific impact. So reaching a certain number of people is a valuable piece, but not the impact in and of itself. So we developed a list, and we started narrowing the list and refining the list until we got to something we felt we were comfortable with. And from there, we looked at how can we build this out into an actual piece of software. Because we wanted to take this from a single newsroom up to more newsrooms who might be interested in doing this, and also to make it easier. Once you start adding quite a bit into a Google form, you'll end up, you've probably all seen this, where you end up with a pretty large spreadsheet. So then we took it into a piece of software, and now it's a fully fledged impact tracker that we are developing on at this moment. And so you start, those are your impact types that we've chosen to pay attention to. And another page here. And this is where I guess I'll spend a moment talking about the difficulty of tracking. Because when you're looking at something like page views and reach, those are server-side metrics, and it's easy to track when something happens because something actually fires, right? Or something actually pings. And so that is all recorded by you. If I take a week off, I'll still know when I get back what the page views were while I was gone. Impact tracking is very manual. I mentioned in the very beginning that, you know, if you're looking for somebody to say, this law change is all due to the Detroit Free Press, keep holding your breath. that happens at times, but in my experience, it's been pretty rare. So you need to connect the dots. If they did say that, you could write a web scraper, perhaps, something that would pick up mentions of the Free Press and connect it back to your story, and it would be a lot easier. And I know there's some development in this area, and I'm really interested to see it sort of grow. And also, that's also a very societal thing, I think, in the United States, where you might see in another country, maybe they're more likely to credit the newsroom, and then it's more possible that you could write a scraper. But in this case, my experience has been that you're going to need to connect the dots yourself. Some marketing departments track this. It's also, my experience, it's better if the reporter does it, because they're going to be able to connect the dots a little bit better, and they're less likely to say, yeah, that was because of my work, if it's not true. So it's essentially, we're asking you to identify the story, narrow it down to an impact type, tell me when the impact happened, and the published date is on another window, and then also describe in full sentences how this coverage led to the impact. So that's the meat of it, is that paragraph at the bottom. And then you end up with paragraphs like this in the database, and those are paragraphs you can lift out. You can use in a column to readers. You can use it in a letter to subscribers. These work quite nicely in newsletters. They're also good for contest entries. They're good for sharing with the staff. I know one newsroom actually talks about page view counts in their morning meeting, and then also includes mentions of impact. And so you can use these any number of ways once you've started collecting them. And this is how we've chosen to use them at the Free Press. This is the page Jen mentioned. You can find it at freep.com/impact. And once you type that in and hit return, it'll roll over to a subscription URL. So we're pairing this and working with the subscriptions department and saying, how can we message this in a way that encourages subscriber support? And the Free Press does not have a paywall online. And so what we're really asking you to do is subscribe to the print edition, and understanding that when you do that, you're supporting the journalism that brings change in this community. So that's one way. Another thing I'm really excited to show you guys that we did for the first time this year is we produced a community impact report. And here I need to give credit where credit is due. This inspiration comes from the Minneapolis Star-Tribune and Suki Dardarian. And they came up with this, did this last year, and I thought, why didn't we do that? So this year we did, and what you'll see on the left is sort of a chunk of the online version. We asked for tips. We also said thank you. In the middle, you'll see the print version, and that went out in one of our Sunday editions toward the end of the year. And the goal there with that was that we wanted to make sure that it got in the hands of subscribers. So I don't work a lot directly in print these days, but I did for this because I thought it was very important that we got this message out to subscribers first and foremost. So that was a print section that went out. After that section appeared in the paper, we did a reader survey, a subscriber survey, and we saw a 20% increase, 20 percentage point increase in satisfaction with the Free Press from our subscribers. After publishing that, we surveyed them before, we surveyed them after. And that just blew us away. We were not expecting that, but we saw people saying that we have a positive mission. They had no idea we did all of this investigative journalism, and that this is what Detroit and Michigan really need. So that was incredibly encouraging. And what you see on the right is we wanted another copy of this, something that, wouldn't have the ink on your hands and that sort of thing, that we could take out to funders and to community leaders and to other stakeholders. And that's the one on the right. It's glossy. It's 32 pages, I believe. We hosted an event this morning with 300 community leaders, and we made sure they all got a copy of that when they walked out today. So I'm very excited for this. It's brand new for us. If anybody wants to know how we did this or how we pulled it together, again, credit to Suki, but I'd be happy to walk you through that. And I have some resources for you here too. This is if you want to go deeper on the subject of impact and how you might do some tracking. Leading off here is the Norman Lear Center's Media Impact Project, and they do some great work. I'm a contributor there, and you'll see my work around journalism. There's an article, white paper from ProPublica. I think that's a must read. You'll see Lindsay Green Barber, a link to her work there, and much credit to James Hamilton, who looked at the economics of investigative journalism. It's just a really enlightening read. So those are great. I'll give those to Jen, and she can share them with you all. And if anyone has any questions, I am happy to talk about impact all hours of the day. There's my email address. And also, just so I can meet more of you and we can get some good discussion going, please join this new Facebook group. It's called Impact Journalism Pros, and anybody can jump in and join us for a discussion. So
Anjanette, before we jump in with Mark and the reporters, we do have one quick question that is very much about what you were just discussing. It came in from one of our participants, and they wanted to know, for the Google survey that you did, was that, who filled that out? Is that the journalists filling out the survey, or was that open to the community to submit impact?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. It was only open to the journalists. And not that I don't want to take it to the community at some point, because I think there's real value in that, because there are a lot of times where I've found, especially if you're a reporter and you kind of dropped in to do one story and then you're back to your regular beat, you may not realize what just happened. We had done a story when I was in Westchester, and it wasn't high-level investigative work. It was an excellent community story. It was about a convent that had it was the middle of winter and the boiler broke, and the sisters were very cold. And they sent us a story about it, or a press release about it. They sent us a link to their GoFundMe and a picture of one of the sisters underneath a pile of blankets trying to stay warm. And we published that story, and within a day, probably, of us publishing that story, they had enough money to buy a new boiler. And it's something we wouldn't know, except for they came back and told us and said, thank you for that article. And I think there are more things out there that we don't hear about. We don't maybe check back, or they don't reach out to say thank you. And so I think there's really an interesting space to move there. But I'll tell you, I started with the investigative journalists thinking that's where we were going to stop. And we started spreading it out to the whole newsroom, including to a woman covering restaurant news. And once you start paying attention, it really happens in all corners of the newsroom.
That's awesome to hear. And thank you for answering that question. So I guess now we're going to throw things over to Mark, Phoebe, Kat, and Joe, and hear from them a little bit about how they use this information that you collect in their reporting. I'll let you guys take over.
Well, I'll just start off by saying that here at the Free Press, we have one of the largest full-time investigative reporting operations in the company, which allows us to not only do a lot of high-impact investigative journalism on a routine basis, but it also it builds up an expectation in the community that this is just part of the fabric of the Free Press, and it's part of the mission we believe in, and that they can expect to see a steady diet of investigative reporting from this newspaper. I think that partly explains why we do see so much real-world change from the investigative journalism that we do. Just in the last couple of years, we've had federal investigations launched, congressional reviews, we've had state laws changed, we had a Sydney ordinance rewritten, which is a story that Joe produced. We've had, just a few months ago, we got a man who was facing a 50-year prison sentence, who was wrongly convicted, released from prison. And as Anjanette alluded to, sometimes you don't get credit from the sources or the targets of an investigation for instituting change, but sometimes you actually do. And in the instance of some state laws we've had changed, and some of our representatives in Congress have named us as the source of why they're addressing a particular issue. It does happen, and one of the things I'm most proud of the work that we've done here is that most of the change we'll be talking about in the stories we'll be discussing during this webinar, the change was pretty immediate. In some cases, we've had actual things happen the day of publication, the next day after publication. So some of the changes from some of the journalism we've done have actually been almost immediate. So I think Kat and Joe will be talking about one of the biggest stories that we did last year, which was investigation of the mayor of Detroit and some conflicts of interest that we learned about through their investigative efforts. And from that point, I'll turn it over to Kat and Joe.
Sorry about that. Okay, I'll pick it up from there. So as you can see in the upper left of that slide, our story was about city resources that went to a local nonprofit that was run by a woman who had a mysterious relationship with the mayor of Detroit. And within days of this story publishing, the city's inspector general launched an investigation to decide if the mayor had used any preferential treatment in directing these city resources to the nonprofit. So it was clear, right away that our story had an impact. But what we decided to do, the approach we took, was more as kind of treating it as a development in the investigation. And the way that we handled it led to more stories and kind of a snowball effect of the impact. So once the Inspector General launched the investigation, we decided to try to, one, develop sources within the Inspector General's office to get an idea of how they were handling the investigation, and also stay vigilant with other people around the city and with our sources to kind of get an idea of how it was being handled, who they were interviewing, that kind of thing. And it didn't take long before we were able to meet a whistleblower who, based on our reporting, decided to come forward and raise questions about the nonprofit that she was experiencing in her office. And one of the things she complained about to both the city's inspector general and the state of Michigan's attorney general was she thought that there were some employees deleting emails to cover up the extent of the city's support for this nonprofit. So that led to a whole other kind of thread we began to pull to try to prove that the city was, some people in the city staff were deleting emails. And eventually, once we got that nailed down and we reported that story, that launched a second investigation related to our original story, and that was a criminal investigation by the state attorney general to see if any laws had been broken. So while that was going on, we still stayed, up to date with the inspector general's investigation based on our original report. We filed FOIA requests to get information about that investigation. When those FOIA requests were, we kind of used the term constructively denied based on the astronomical fee they they wanted to charge us, over $200,000 for the documents involved in the investigation. And because that amount was so high and prohibitive, we just decided to write about it. And that was a way for us to show our readers and show those investigating this situation that we're taking this seriously. We're going to be keeping an eye on this. And that report, generated more interest in the investigation and in our reporting. And it's hard to tell how those kind of stories actually impacted the actual investigation. But when the Inspector General did release its report several months after our initial story, it backed up a lot of our reporting, and it showed that the Inspector General did conduct a quite thorough investigation, something that we were kind of dubious about from the beginning, simply because the city's Inspector General was hired by the mayor. So that's kind of, in retrospect, one of the main takeaways is that, impact doesn't and shouldn't be like a box to check. We treated it as a kind of a development in our investigation and reported on it as such, which led to a lot more stories and further impact.
And just to add on what Joe has already said, so this nonprofit actually it's called Make Your Date, and it focuses on preterm birth. And in the city of Detroit, we have one of the highest, if not the highest, rates of preterm births, as well as infant mortality. And if you have paid attention to a lot of national stories recently, there's been a lot of coverage about even maternal mortality. So this was a very timely and important story that we felt we should tell. On its face, it kind of looks like just a government story, but this story has a lot of impact on the community. Detroit has one of the highest poverty rates in the country. So we're talking about a historically disadvantaged community, mothers who don't readily have access to good medical care, as well as even some medical and racial bias that's a part of the medical system. So this story that you see on the screen, we wrote this after several months of our ongoing investigation, and it showed that while the city had said this program was its preeminent way of dealing with the city's high rate of preterm births, the problem, instead of decreasing, had actually dramatically increased, which further illustrated why it was so important for us to tell this story.
I'll chime in with one last point about this effort. It became very clear to us early on in reporting these stories that the Attorney General's office was actually following our reporting in the newspaper. And they initially, when they first started reviewing what was going on, it was kind of a passive, well, we're monitoring things, we're keeping an eye on this. And the more we reported, the more interested they got in this. It's not often that the Attorney General will investigate a municipal government operation like this. And it was only after the deleted emails issue came up that the Attorney General personally ordered her staff to investigate the administration and what employees had done there to hinder this investigation. So, as Joe alluded to, impact, it can be a running kind of thing. It definitely influenced sort of the pace of stories we pursued. We wanted to keep the pressure on. We wanted to make it clear to the administration that we weren't going to stand for things like them interfering or trying to interfere with our investigation, with them sort of bad-mouthing the reporters involved in the story and basically saying that, that this reporting was false and untrue, and we were attacking people who just wanted to save babies in Detroit. It was very clear that, it was all sort of disinformation campaign against this coming out as a legitimate story. So impact is something you definitely should keep track of as you're pursuing your journalism.
And
sorry, Kat, just on Mark's point about the Attorney General, her office, the Michigan Attorney General's office, initially did not show a very high interest in investigating the deleted emails. The whistleblower who raised questions about the deleted emails that I mentioned earlier, she filed a written complaint with the Attorney General's office, and an assistant attorney general in the criminal division initially wrote back to her saying, we understand the city of Detroit is looking into this matter and we'll defer to them. as our reporting progressed and we knew we had a story about deleted emails and went back to the Attorney General to let them know and to see if they wanted to comment, that's when the Attorney General spoke up, essentially reopened her office's investigation into the deleted emails, and the Attorney General personally handled that. So that kind of happened in real time.
And just to quickly add, for me, the greatest impact was community impact. You know, we saw a lot of other television stations as well as another newspaper. A lot of people were following our coverage. But the main thing was hearing directly from residents who this story impacted. We got so many additional tips from people to follow up on that, kind of informed a lot of our reporting along the way. And what this story also did, which is kind of hard to measure, is that it impacted the mayor's administration in terms of public trust. There were a lot of questions, a lot of concerns raised by community members who will come down to city council meetings to share their anger about a lot of what was uncovered during the course of our reporting. Their concerns about transparency, integrity, the need for the mayor to rebuild their trust. So impact occurred in that way as well.
So I want to bring Phoebe into the conversation here. This is the bulk of your year last year, right, Phoebe, investigating Ford and transmissions put in the Fiesta and help me out. The Fiesta and the Focus cars. Yes, Phoebe, you're muted. So
Okay.
I'll let you take
hear me
over
now?
from
Yeah.
here. Yep.
Okay. Thanks. So this is the Ford Focus and Fiesta, but a couple things worth noting. So I'm a beat reporter. I am part of a team that files stories every single day or every other day. And so if we're doing an investigation like this, you're sort of shoehorning this in the middle of everything else. And what's interesting about this story is we made this discovery after looking at a basic earnings report. So a corporation in our community, every quarter you file an earnings report, say how you're doing, and at the end of the 70-page report, we notice that there's a warning to investors that the company is saying, you know, brace yourselves, we're looking at a multi-million-dollar threat here. And it made reference to a transmission I knew nothing about. And I went to my editor and I said, do you know anything about these? This is at the bottom of 70 pages. And he's like, you know, let's file your daily and let's circle back. What ended up happening is I went and did some Google searching on on court hearings to find out what was going on that no one was reporting, and wrote just a basic story on this is what's happening in the state of California. We ran the story and initially had, I don't know, over 100 calls and emails on the first day from people who wanted to send me their printed records of repairs and how the company was not responding, how they were paying loans on vehicles that couldn't be driven. The impact that we measured was this. Members of Congress read the coverage and they called for investigation. The Department of Justice launched a federal probe into possible corruption and fraud, specifically fraud. And then also you had multiple people inside the company reading about these reports and asking to talk with us and provide us documents from inside the company. So we wrote a basic story. Then we saw there were all these other things that needed to be reported. People reaching out, setting up confidential ways to communicate. As a result, not only were there congressional and judicial responses, but the company itself issued expansion of its warranty to benefit 600,000 owners around the country. All while this is happening on this one series, what started to happen in addition in terms of impact is we started receiving calls on other subjects. So because of the public trust that was built, because we were providing documents of billing, interaction with the company, not taking people's word for it, but providing things you could read yourself on links, In addition, we started hearing from inside factories and again, inside world headquarters, where we started to learn that in fact, other vehicles, current brand new vehicles were having so much trouble, they were not being shipped to dealerships. So specifically, the Lincoln Aviator, the Ford Explorer, the Ford Police Interceptor. We found out that parts on the vehicles weren't working, and we had people providing us video, audio, and documents, specifically because they said, we saw how we handled, the Detroit Free Press handled very sensitive information previously, therefore we could be trusted to expose something unfolding in real time. We were the only media outlet to uncover all these problems. We had police departments on the West Coast reaching out to us and saying, we can't get our police vehicles, we're so far behind schedule. That became a public safety concern. What ended up happening is while the company was maintaining everything was fine, another outcome impact is, of course, in upcoming sales and finance reports. Everything that we reported was then cited. And again, we then had more trust built and impact that more stories came. So we were shining a spotlight on things, building public trust that was resulting in judicial and congressional impact and shareholder impact. People were learning things, stockholders and shareholders. And as important, engineers inside the company were saying, their hope is to get things fixed, and they can only see action if the press is reporting. So things were really snowballing. Our impact is it led to additional stories on other topics, and I just want to leave it there and just to give you an idea, and that's what we've experienced in the last 6 months. Anjanette, do you have any questions, or do you want to open it up?
I think, Jen, we'll toss it back to you.
Yeah, sure. So we do have a question right here that we'll start with. And they wanted to know, why is it, do you think, that the story on Ford specifically got so much national attention? Was it because of the story? Was it because of your ability to share the story more widely through the USA Today network? Was it sort of a combination of factors?
So Lester Holt at NBC News picked up our story immediately and an enormous piece on it. Secondly, the story had huge social media pickup where people who owned Ford Focus and Ford Fiesta automatic transmission vehicles were sharing the stories with friends and family saying, it's not just me. What we found is aggressive response because so many people thought that they were the only ones having these problems, that cars were jerking into intersections. And the driving, they were told, it was just their bad driving. When our stories came out, it affirmed there was a pattern that was documented. And people were shocked and they were relieved. People called crying. Old people felt humiliated. So the reaction was swift, hundreds. We created an Excel sheet on every part of America that called. And I think at our last count, we had 40 states in the US that we had feedback from.
Wow.
I think
writing to their members of Congress. They copied me on letters. One wrote Costco Corporation and the CEO intervened on their behalf to help them. Things like that.
Hey, Phoebe, I think one of the things that was really interesting about that to me was that you all of a sudden started listening to people who felt they weren't being listened to, right? And so somebody's listening, somebody cares, because these are people who had years and years of trouble with their cars and they kept trying to get it fixed. And then, you know, what options do they have? And so finally you were listening, and I think you just opened the floodgates and the sharing happened from there.
Yeah, it was interesting that people were being told you'd have a car that's 3 years old and you're doing 3 and 4 transmission changes, right? So it's thousands of dollars every time you go in. And they said they would go to lawyers, they'd ask for help, but just talking to a reporter and then documenting their experiences, we found trends. But what that did in terms of impact is, again, it showed a public trust in the free press, and I think it parlayed into additional stories, both on my beat and also on other beats, particularly in automotive. But it really led to many, many other stories and exclusives. Yeah.
So Phoebe, Kat, and Joe, for the three of you, you know, most of us, we get into journalism because we want to have these kinds of impacts. And as Anjanette mentioned earlier, it's very rare that newsrooms, reporters get the credit for making these changes and bringing this stuff to light so that changes can be made. What does it feel like having the impact tracker and being able to, with Anjanette's help, track and actually see the real world impact your stories are having? What is that experience like?
Guys, do you want to take it?
Well,
Go for it.
I'll say, you know, Anjanette said earlier, you know, page views are important because without readership, the impact might not be there. But having the impact tracker and knowing our newsroom focuses on that really helps to keep me focused and, you know, focused on important things, not necessarily the types of stories that would drive page views. I mean, there are some, obviously, investigative stories that have a lot of impact do result in high page views, but other times, I mean, it could be, you know, news of the weird or run-of-the-mill crime stories that generate a lot of page views. And knowing that we're tracking impact, you know, keeps us focused on actual investigations and, you know, journalism that takes a lot of effort, and the payoff is rewarded.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Joe, but for me, the best feeling is to have these discussions with residents, Detroit residents who have shared via email, in person, Facebook, social media, why it was so important for us to do these stories. That's what it's really all about, is the actual community impact and hearing directly from the readers. And for me, that has been the most amazing part of this long, hard investigation, is seeing what it means to Detroiters, that the Detroit Free Press, you know, our logo is we're on guard, and we are looking into issues that matter to them. And I think this investigation illustrates why local news is so important, and why it's so important that newspapers really invest in this type of reporting, whether it's ours or Phoebe's. I mean, it has local and national impact.
In terms of feeling, I think the most profound thing for me is that the number of people who've written emails and actually sent handwritten cards, for thank you cards from around the country, is what they've written again and again is that our work restores their faith. It restores their faith in their belief that they can make the world a better place, and that the world is inherently a good place. That you have people having horrible experiences and they reach out to a newspaper, and because the newspaper listens, they're seeing change. And they will say again and again, someone will eventually listen. If we continue to speak on whatever subject, someone will eventually come and help us. And that to me is profound.
So we have a question here for Mark, and they want to know if the success of these investigations and the impact has changed the way the newsroom covers business and government. You know, is the way you're able to monitor the impact and actually see the real world results changing how you tackle these topics in the future?
I wouldn't say it's changed the way we approach stories. It's definitely an affirmation of the work that we do. I've been overseeing investigations for 25 years, so this has basically been my approach to doing investigative reporting, is to sit down and talk with reporters when we first start checking out a tip or talking about a story idea. We actually bake that into the recipe for, is this going to be a story we pursue, or are we going to put this aside and pursue something that's more of a priority? A quick example, about a year or so ago, Joe was looking into a story about whether the company that just built our new the arena for our hockey team and the Detroit Pistons also owns a whole bunch of parking lots around the arena. surface lots. And they built these parking lots around the time the arena was opening, and they didn't build them according to city ordinance. They didn't have the necessary green space and some other requirements that most other companies had to abide by, including General Motors. But for some reason, these lots were built without meeting those specifications. And so Joe and I were talking about this story, and we just sort of talked through some of the fundamentals, and we sort of talked about, well, yeah, because the company was able to do this, they saved money on parking lot construction. They're able to make significantly more revenue because they aren't meeting these city restrictions. They could have more parking spaces and generate more revenue. And we sort of talked about that. Well, is that good enough? Is that really going to be a story that we pursue? We sort of talked about, why is the average reader going to care? What kind of change could come about as of this story? And we decided that, the element of, hey, I think we calculated it's going to be, they could make $1 million extra by not following, city ordinance. And so after our story published, that's exactly the change that happened. The city rewrote their ordinance so that no other company could ignore city ordinance and build parking lots of this nature. And, is that as dramatic as some of the other impact we've seen? No, but again, it was a signal to readers in the community that we held one of the biggest corporate entities in the city and in the state. We held them accountable for what they had done, revealed what shortcuts they'd taken, how they got advantages that other companies in town didn't, and there was an actual reaction. Something happened as a result of that reporting. So what we do is we talk these things through when we're talking about our stories up front. And as we alluded to earlier, if there are impacts that will guide future reporting, we'll certainly do that. But that's pretty much how that works in the newsroom, how that plays out in the newsroom on a daily basis.
And if I can piggyback on that a little bit, impact tracking in its basic form is taking those notes and letters and things that Phoebe and Kat and Joe are talking about and just making sure they're all in the same place, right? Whether it's a box or an email inbox or something along those lines. But once you start doing or having the conversations that Mark is talking about, where you're thinking about and talking about the impact up front, then you can start getting into more complex and interesting ways of tracking your impact. And you can start thinking, is this a project where we actually want to measure, for instance, if public sentiment towards an issue or a person perhaps has changed? And then how do we survey that before and after the reporting? There are plenty of examples out there where you can start getting specific on that. One I would recommend is another one that Lindsay Green Barber did on when she was at the Center for Investigative Reporting. It was on strawberries and pesticide, where they did this really intense effort to track the impact of that project. So you can start small, or you can move into a bigger avenue once you start having those conversations like Mark mentioned.
So we have a sort of follow-up question that piggybacks on that. Someone wants to know, what if you have a more narrative sort of story, for example, just a really good narrative story about a community member? How do you measure impact when the story might not have a sort of legal or governmental outcome? Is that something that you can track and that you should be trying to track?
Yeah, can I take that? Because I had that happen. We actually had a member of our community, a tiny, not known by anyone until we wrote about her. She circled back and said the number of global companies. She was actually asked to serve on boards. Google was one, but they explicitly cited our story and she said it was transformational. She's an internationally accomplished businesswoman, and she said the impact of this story, I had invitations to be on boards of directors in various parts of the world. That is one example that is absolutely trackable. They will get board invitations or be thrown off a board. There are personal experiences that will be affected, positive and negative, for sure.
And I'll add, this was, gosh, I can't remember how long ago. This was when I was still on the breaking news desk, but I wrote a story about a young woman who was the victim of, she was shot and she was paralyzed. And her father and her lived in this very small, cramped house on Detroit's west side. They had trouble getting around, and she just really wanted to get out and experience the city. It had been such a long time since she had even been able to go to a park just because they didn't have adequate transportation. And after we wrote this story, it was a beautiful story. We had video, photos that just really illustrated how tough it was for her. Someone reached out and they gave the family a new van for her to move around in. And that's a story where it's not an investigation, but it's impact, right? It's direct impact in the community for people. So I think it's definitely possible to attract impact on a variety of stories and topics.
Yeah, and I would say that, that can be as simple as following up with the subject of your story, a day later, the same day, a week later, those types of things. Or it can be something where you decide, I'm going to look out for this beforehand. And so you're not just picking up the phone, but you're actually saying, what are going to be the signs of that and how can I assess them? So in Phoebe's case, right, of this woman saying she was being asked to serve on several boards, maybe what you set up is some sort of Google News alert for mentions of her name. You can do the same with the story Kat mentioned. If some of that fundraising happens online, you could set up some alerts to maybe things like GoFundMe. Are people starting to organize around this person? And what can you look for in that area?
So sort of on that same topic, Anjanette, how can, editors, reporters out there right now who are watching and want to get started on tracking impact, what are some basic first steps they can take to, start trying this in their own newsrooms?
Yeah, I think, the biggest thing is getting everyone on the same page. Sitting down with folks who are interested in doing this and having a conversation. What's important to us? What do we want to track? What do we want to measure? And then how are we going to do it? So your list of impacts that you're trying to track might be different than mine. If you're, say, a newsroom that really places a lot of value in other publications picking up your reporting, that might rank higher than it does for me. If you're a newsroom that values individual social shares, regardless of who they might be, then that might pop as something that's more valuable to your newsroom. So have those conversations. What are we looking for? What's most important to us? And how do we align our journalism around that? And then how do we start tracking? So I would have that conversation first, then you know what you're looking for. And from there, it's up to you. You can build the software. I wouldn't let that hold you up though. You can start a spreadsheet somewhere. You can start a Google form. You can just create a folder and say, dump all of your emails and notes in here. Sometimes when we have a running project, like say the one Kat and Joe have been working on for months and months, or like Phoebe's project for months and months, I'll just start up a Google Doc and say, here you go, add, whatever you're seeing and hearing to this. And then we'll start to filter down. Mm-hmm.
Can I just give a tip to editors for something that Anjanette did that I think was really helpful for the reporters? When you institute something like this, if you ask, in my opinion, if you ask reporters to create files, people will have an anxiety attack. But if you can just email links to one person or email descriptions, it somehow strips away the drama and you ease into the documenting much more quickly, and it makes you, it takes away the anxiety. So if we're asked to set up new files and do all these things in addition to reporting, it's an awful lot. Initially, we sent things to Anjanette. She was our point person to kind of herd the cats. And I think that allowed reporters to warm up to the idea and see the value more quickly.
So sort of to follow up on that, Mark, for you, as the head of investigations and the editor who's section has probably the most immediately understandable and concrete impact was the process of actually tracking the impact with Anjanette and the different tools she brought to the Free Press. Was that a shift that took some time to get used to, or was it sort of something you'd already been doing in your own way and now you had a more seamless way to do it?
Yeah, it was really just a matter of being able to shape and organize what we were already tracking. We tend to write follow-up stories on some of the bigger impacts that we see, if a state law gets changed, if someone goes to jail or gets out of jail, those sorts of things. So it wasn't a cultural change in that sense of needing to convince each other that, hey, this is something we should do and we should let our readers know we're doing it. It was more, how are we going to do this? What's the most seamless workflow we can organize to make this more systemic, to spread it around the newsroom? One of the things that is really gratifying about the work that gets done here, my apologies if I didn't make this clear earlier. Like I said, we do have a large investigative reporting team here at the Free Press, but investigative reporting is something that happens all around the room. Kat and Joe aren't actually assigned to the investigative team. They just do a lot of investigations. Phoebe is a business writer. We've had other reporters in the newsroom who've done outstanding investigations just off of their beats. So it's really more of a matter of, hey, let's create a tool that we can sort of show other people around the newsroom, hey, not only is it important to do great work, it's important to let our readers know that we're doing it and that it's leading to some change. So it's really more a conversation with Anjanette and I. Hey, we're already tracking a lot of stuff. Let's get it out there in front of the newsroom and in front of our readers.
Awesome. Anjanette, did you have anything you wanted to add to that answer from Mark?
I did, yeah. I mean, I think, I brought the tracker, but it really is what Mark is saying. The tracking was happening in a form. And I think when we're talking about how people can just get started doing this, it's really critical to know that you can just get started doing this, and most of us are, right? Most of us are sending an email to our editors saying, hey, guess what I just heard? You're already tracking. Most of us are saving, the letter we got, if we still actually get snail mail, right? We got a card in the mail thanking us for the impact report, and it was handwritten. So we're already stuffing those things in folders and things like that. And so, building a tracker allows you to keep it all in one place and make use of it. And like Mark said, sharing it with readers. And I think that's incredibly valuable. So different levels, but all of it fantastic. Yep.
The one thing. Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry. The one thing I might add that we haven't discussed already. As you're developing your own tracker, you might want to consider things. Here are things that we've learned that we may not want to make public yet or at all. Sometimes you have impacts that you don't really want to share with readers right away. We had a story where we basically investigated a government program that was supposed to help keep people in their homes, but was really leading to more and faster foreclosures here in Detroit and in Wayne County. And after we did our story, we got some tips from HUD and other agencies that say, hey, we're really interested in looking at this. We've been reading your stories, and this is definitely a problem we need to look into. Don't tell anybody, but we're sending agents to Detroit, and we're going to do some work on the ground and figure out, is this a government investigation we should launch? And we didn't want to report that until we had something to actually say about it. But it was definitely something that we scribbled down on napkins and said, hey, we need to follow up on this when it happens. But we didn't want to impede an actual investigation by announcing it to the public before anything had actually started. And it's still something we're sort of keeping an eye on, but hasn't been formally cemented. Yeah, this is an actual full-blown federal investigation, but it's definitely an outgrowth of our work. And I think you might want to consider that when you're developing your own tracker. Are there things, tips, things we may not want to share immediately.
Well, one tiny thing I wanted to share is sometimes we talk about impact as really big and federal action, all these different things, but we ran a story at the Detroit Free Press about a fire, and it was about 3 homes burning to the ground. And in the story, it mentions a lady and her cat. As a result of that story, we received letters from different parts of the US, including a teacher in Kansas City. She included 30 drawings. It was 30 or 32 drawings from her school children. She used the fire story and the story of the kitty cat to teach fire safety to the children. And she said it was the approach of a fire story in the Detroit Free Press that gave her the angle that children would understand fire safety if they could think of it in terms of their pets. And so that was an example of something that's seemingly very, very trivial, but very high impact. And yeah, they shipped all the drawings of the children made after their fire safety class to the Free Press. It was pretty special.
Oh, that is amazing. So I don't want to keep anyone too long. Anjanette, I'm going to ask you to, if you could share your screen back over here. I want to thank the Detroit Free Press for joining us today. We were so thrilled to have you guys. It means so much to have you, Anjanette, Mark, Phoebe, Kat, and Joe. If after today's webinar, anyone watching is interested in submitting a story of your own to the News Impact Project, you can do so on the Alliance website at newsmediaalliance.org. You can also, if you have questions about the submission project, the process, or how to get involved and participate with us, you can email me at jennifer@newsmediaalliance.org. And a recording of the webinar, as well as links to the slides, stories, and all the resources discussed today by myself and the Detroit Free Press team, will be available on the News Media Alliance website by tomorrow and will be emailed to all participants. So please be on the lookout for that. And thank you again, everyone, and a special thanks to Anjanette, Mark, Kat, Joe, and Phoebe, and the Detroit Free Press for being huge partners in this project and really hitting home how to track impact. Thank you, everyone.